How does a man with Parkinson's disease, whose memory is so shattered he no longer knows his own name, get legally licensed for a professional fist fight? The answer is envelopes of cash stuffed into the pockets of corrupt doctors. When Frankie Randall defeated boxing's biggest cash cow, he ruined a multi-million-dollar casino script. In retaliation, ruthless promoters and syndicate bosses weaponized his illness. They needed a famous name to feed to their younger, profitable prospects to build them up. So the system falsified his medical records, bypassed state laws, and shoved the three-time world champion back into the ring as a bloody mobile punching bag. They didn't see a human being, they saw a dying neurological patient, and they systematically squeezed his deteriorating brain for every last dime to balance their ledgers. Frankie Billy Randall was born on September the 25th, 1961, in Birmingham, Alabama, and raised in Morristown, Tennessee. Standing 5 feet and 9 inches tall with a 68-inch reach, his physical mechanics were elite. Turning professional in 1981 at the age of 20, he weaponized these traits immediately. He adopted the moniker The Surgeon. The title was not a marketing gimmick. It was a highly accurate clinical description of his utility inside the ring. Randall did not brawl. He fought with cold, calculated mathematics. He dissected opponents using a punishing left jab, severe lateral angles, and precise counterpunching that dismantled men physically and psychologically. He stripped away an opponent's defense with systematic, unfeeling efficiency. But this elite skill level instantly became his biggest professional liability. The tragedy of Frankie Randall was established the moment he displayed his competence. The surgeon did not own the operating table, and he had absolutely no control over the blade. In the business of professional fighting, a young, highly skilled prospect without a powerful manager is a structural threat to the system. Promoters build their empires by protecting specific ticket sellers, marketable fighters groomed for lucrative television contracts. Opponents are handpicked to make these investments look formidable without posing a genuine threat. Randall was too lethal to be used as an opponent. When he stepped into regional rings, he systematically destroyed carefully curated local favorites, ruining the financial investments of the promoters hosting the events. Because he disrupted the business model, the gatekeepers of the sport immediately recognized the danger and shut him out. His extraordinary talent ensured his isolation. Promoters refused to put their rising stars in the ring with him. The system's response was a deliberate, coordinated freeze-out. Lacking a connected power broker to force mandatory title eliminators, Randall was trapped in a financial and professional purgatory. To survive, he was forced into a grueling, exploitative schedule. Between his debut in 1981 and 1989, Randall fought 31 times. He was forced to accept short-notice bouts, taking fights on a few days' notice against larger men. He traveled by car to hostile venues to fight in front of judges paid by his opponent's promoters. He was compensated with fraction of a percent purses, taking home only a few $100s for shedding blood over 8 or 10 rounds. To prepare for these scraps, he endured thousands of rounds of undocumented, unpaid sparring. He operated in brutal gyms where fighters are treated as disposable crash test dummies. This is where his neurological decay began. Long before he ever saw a Las Vegas marquee, the micro concussions were compounding. Every sparring session stripped away a microscopic layer of brain tissue. The cartilage in his hands deteriorated. The structural integrity of his jaw weakened. He was trading his long-term cognitive health just to secure a spot on weekend undercards. Despite the deliberate sabotage by matchmakers, Randall accumulated a 17-fight win streak. It meant absolutely nothing to the ruling class of the sport. His pristine record was buried off television. The promoters deliberately kept him invisible, actively starving him out. They wanted him desperate. The strategy was mathematical: break his patience, ensure his absolute financial dependency, and keep him available as a cheap, disposable substitute. The physical damage Randall sustained during this 8-year lockout was permanent, but the psychological toll was catastrophic. He was dedicating his youth, his brain, and his body to a system that actively punished him for being exceptional. He watched less talented, heavily promoted fighters secure massive paydays and title shots while he was forced to fight for rent money in empty arenas. The frustration of hitting an invisible, impenetrable ceiling built by corrupt matchmakers began to fracture his mental foundation. He was a weapon kept locked in a basement, rusting in the dark, waiting for an opportunity that his handlers actively worked to deny him. This deliberate, systemic marginalization stripped him of his autonomy and pushed him directly toward the edge of a psychological cliff. He was primed for a total collapse. By the late 1980s, Frankie Randall was trapped in a financial paradox. He was a professional athlete, possessing a spectacular win-loss record, yet he could not generate a living wage. The regional promoters had successfully frozen him out of lucrative television dates. The sanctioning bodies, the WBC, WBA, and IBF, ignored him in their rankings because he lacked a manager willing to pay the required under-the-table sanctioning bribes. Pushed into absolute financial desperation and stripped of any legitimate upward mobility, Randall defaulted to the street economy. In August 1989, the trap closed. Randall was targeted in a local sting operation and arrested for selling cocaine to an undercover police officer. He was not a kingpin. He was a desperate, financially starved athlete, liquidating street-level narcotics to bridge the gap between insulting boxing purses. The justice system was swift and unforgiving. He was convicted of a felony drug charge and sentenced to 17 months in state prison. The hypocrisy of the American regulatory system was on full display. The state imprisoned Randall for peddling narcotics, yet athletic commissions routinely licensed promoters who peddled the permanent brain damage of young men for pay-per-view revenue. The prison sentence robbed Randall of his late 20s, the absolute apex of a professional fighter's athletic prime. From age 27 to 29, his physical window was forcibly boarded up. Inside a concrete cell, muscle mass atrophied, timing deteriorated. The cardiovascular engine required for elite combat sports idled and rusted. More importantly, the felony conviction permanently branded him. He was no longer just an isolated, high-risk fighter. He was a convicted felon with zero leverage, re-entering a predatory industry that specializes in exploiting the desperate. Randall was paroled in 1991. He walked out of prison 30 years old, financially destitute and legally compromised. This is the exact moment the vultures circled. A 30-year-old paroled felon cannot secure conventional employment, but in the boxing underworld, a desperate man with a violent skill set is a highly liquid asset. Enter Don King and the elite syndicate of boxing power brokers. Prior to prison, promoters avoided Randall because he was too dangerous to their investments. After prison, they welcomed him because his legal and financial ruin meant they could finally control him through predatory paperwork. To understand the destruction of Frankie Randall, you must understand the architecture of a 1990s boxing contract. It is an instrument of indentured servitude, known in the industry as the options clause. When Randall sought a path back to the ring, he was forced to sign promotional agreements that granted promoters exclusive, unilateral control over his career. If they offered him a fight, he had to take it. If he won, the contract automatically extended, granting the promoter options on his next 3 to 5 fights. The promoter dictated the opponent, the venue, and the purse. If Randall refused, he was in breach of contract and legally barred from fighting for anyone else. He was effectively locked in a financial chokehold. The system did not rehabilitate him. It weaponized his desperation. They threw him back onto the undercards, feeding him low-level opponents to build up his record on paper, completely under their financial thumb. Between late 1991 and 1992, Randall was forced onto an aggressive, high-frequency fight schedule to generate tape for his new handlers. He fought constantly, rebuilding his stamina, but he was still categorized as a stepping stone asset. The promoters were simply fattening him up to be slaughtered by one of their premium stars. That moment arrived in January 1993. The promoters booked Randall against Edwin Rosario. Rosario was a former world champion, a violent, heavy-handed Puerto Rican star who was intended to violently dismiss Randall and move on to a title shot. Randall was brought in entirely as a designated victim to make Rosario look impressive on television. Randall refused to read the script. Operating on pure survival instinct, he outboxed, dismantled, and ultimately knocked out Rosario in the 7th round. It was a spectacular, violent upset. But in the ruthless mathematics of professional boxing, Randall's victory was a catastrophe for the promoters. He had violently derailed their investment in Rosario. However, because Randall was bound by the ironclad options clause, the promoters still owned him. If they could not use Rosario to cash out, they would simply use Randall as the new sacrificial lamb for a much bigger, much deadlier predator. By knocking out Rosario, Randall inadvertently forced himself into the mandatory challenger position for the WBC Super Lightweight Championship. That belt was held by Julio César Chávez. Chávez was not just a champion, he was an industry monopoly. Holding a record of 89 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw, Chávez was the primary financial engine for Don King Productions and the entire Las Vegas casino infrastructure. He generated tens of millions of dollars in pay-per-view buys and closed-circuit television revenue. The system needed Chávez to remain undefeated to maintain his astronomical market value. The promoters looked at the 32-year-old ex-convict, Frankie Randall, and saw the perfect mark. They calculated that Randall possessed just enough skill to make the fight look competitive on paper, but was too old, too ring-worn, and too psychologically damaged to actually threaten the Mexican icon. The casinos set the betting lines at an insulting 15-1, with some sports books pushing it to 18-1. Randall was not booked to fight Chávez. He was contracted to be publicly executed at the MGM Grand to ensure the multi-million-dollar Chávez machine kept printing money. The stage was set for a highly profitable slaughter orchestrated by men who held the deed to Randall's life. January 29, 1994, was not scheduled to be a competitive athletic event. It was designed as a corporate ribbon-cutting ceremony. The newly constructed MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas needed a christening, and Don King Productions delivered the ultimate casino attraction, Julio César Chávez. Chávez held an 89-0-1 record. He was the undisputed engine of the pay-per-view economy. generating massive revenue through Showtime Championship Boxing and closed-circuit theater broadcasts. Frankie Randall was brought in strictly as the opposing meat. He was a 32-year-old ex-convict, selected because the promoters calculated his name carried zero financial weight and his age guaranteed an easy knockout for their primary earner. The financial discrepancy was staggering, reflecting the brutal hierarchy of the sport. Chávez was guaranteed a multi-million-dollar purse, a percentage of the pay-per-view buys, and lucrative casino kickbacks. Randall was paid $150,000. He had zero leverage to negotiate. His signature was already locked in a promotional options contract. If he wanted the fight, he took the flat fee. The contract also included a mandatory rematch clause, a standard predatory legal mechanism. It dictated that in the statistically impossible event Randall won, the promoter retained exclusive rights to his next fight and could force an immediate rematch on their terms, for a purse they dictated. Randall was fighting for his life. The system was fighting for a hedge fund. The media narrative during fight week was entirely dismissive. Journalists and boxing analysts did not treat Randall as a legitimate threat. They focused on his prison stint and his age, framing him as a desperate man looking for one final payday before sliding back into obscurity. The pre-fight press conferences were a circus, heavily focused on Chávez's inevitable march to his 90th victory. Randall was a prop in the background. The system demanded he play the quiet, grateful victim. When the opening bell rang, the script disintegrated. Randall did not fight like a man intimidated by the casino lights. He executed a flawless, violent, tactical blueprint. He utilized a punishing left jab to disrupt Chávez's rhythm, pivoting away from the ropes and denying the Mexican champion the inside leverage he relied on. For 10 rounds, Randall systematically broke down the most feared fighter on the planet. He absorbed heavy body shots but refused to fold, punishing Chávez with razor-sharp counter-rights. The crowd of 14,000 executives, high rollers, and celebrities sat in stunned silence as the financial cornerstone of the boxing industry was dismantled by a 15-1 underdog. In the 11th round, the unthinkable physical reality occurred. Chávez stepped forward aggressively. Randall planted his feet and fired a straight right hand flush onto the champion's chin. Chávez collapsed. It was the first time in 90 professional fights, spanning over 13 years, that Julio César Chávez had been dropped to the canvas. The arena erupted in chaos, but ringside executives recognized a financial disaster. When the final bell rang, the judges submitted their scorecards. It was a split decision. One judge, incredibly, scored the fight for Chávez, highlighting the inherent corruption of Nevada judging. The other two scored it for Randall. He was the new WBC super lightweight champion. Inside the ring, it was a moment of supreme athletic validation. Inside the boardrooms of the MGM Grand and Don King Productions, it was a multi-million-dollar crisis. Randall had just wiped out the undefeated marketing hook that drove Chávez's pay-per-view buys. The promotional machine went into immediate triage. They did not grant Randall the media tour or the respect typical of a new world champion. Instead, they invoked the blood contract. Within hours of the upset, the legal machinery was activated. Don King enforced the mandatory rematch clause. They did not give Randall time to heal. They did not allow him to secure a lucrative voluntary defense against a lesser opponent to cash in on his new title. They forced him back into a training camp immediately. The rematch was booked for May 7th, 1994, a mere 98 days after the first brutal encounter. The system demanded its belt back, and it utilized every administrative advantage to ensure the Las Vegas casino economy was restored to its proper order. The May 7th rematch was a masterclass in regulatory manipulation. Chávez fought with extreme aggression, desperate to erase the stain on his record. Randall stood his ground, engaging in a violent, grueling firefight. The physical toll was massive. By the 8th round, the fight was razor close on the judges' scorecards. Then, the system executed the heist. During a violent exchange, the fighters clashed heads. It was a brutal collision. A massive gash opened over Chávez's right eye, pouring blood down his face. Ringside physician Dr. Flip Homansky examined the cut and advised referee Richard Steele that Chávez could not continue. Under the rules of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, because the fight was stopped due to a headbutt, the decision would go to the scorecards. This is where the theft occurred. Referee Richard Steele, a man who had historically officiated some of Don King's most controversial events, made a unilateral, highly disputed ruling. He declared that Randall had intentionally caused the headbutt, a blatant misrepresentation of the accidental clash. Steele deducted 1 point from Randall. That single administrative deduction altered boxing history. When the scorecards were tallied, one judge had it tied. The other 2 judges scored the fight for Chávez by a single point. Had Steele not deducted the point for the accidental headbutt, the fight would have been declared a technical draw, and Randall would have retained his world title. Instead, the point deduction manipulated the mathematics just enough to hand the victory and the WBC championship back to Julio César Chávez. The media immediately fell in line. Broadcasters glossed over the controversial point deduction, focusing instead on Chávez's courageous performance through a severe cut. The narrative was reset. The anomaly was erased. Frankie Randall had his title legally stripped away by a referee's subjective call in the 8th round of a forced rematch. The corporate machine successfully protected its primary asset, stabilized its future pay-per-view projections, and relegated Randall back to the role of the exploited employee. They squeezed the greatest performance of his life out of him, stole the reward through regulatory chicanery, and left him physically battered, preparing to discard him once again. The psychological fracture of Frankie Randall occurred in the immediate aftermath of the May 1994 Julio César Chávez rematch. The loss was not a physical defeat. It was an administrative execution. Randall realized an inescapable, brutal truth about his profession. Physical superiority inside the ropes was completely irrelevant if the regulatory apparatus was designed to protect the opponent. He had dismantled the industry's primary cash cow twice in 4 months, only to have the championship legally pickpocketed by a referee's subjective deduction. This realization fundamentally altered his approach to the sport. He stopped fighting for legacy. He understood he was an indentured employee in a rigged casino game. The promoters owned his contract, the athletic commissions protected the promoters, and the judges protected the money. The promotional syndicate, specifically Don King Productions, recognized that Randall still held significant market value. He was the man who bled Chávez. They could not put him back in the ring with the Mexican icon. The risk to Chávez's remaining pay-per-view lifespan was too high. Instead, they pivoted Randall toward a different faction of the boxing cartel, the World Boxing Association. The WBA was a deeply entrenched sanctioning body, heavily influenced by South American promoters and managers. The target was the WBA super lightweight champion, Juan Martin Coggi of Argentina. On September 17, 1994, Randall was deployed against Coggy. He executed his job perfectly, winning a unanimous decision and capturing his second world title. But the victory was a hollow transaction. The purses for fighting Coggy were a fraction of the Chávez revenue. Randall was a 33-year-old world champion, yet he was still financially tethered to predatory option clauses. The promoters dictated his schedule, skimming the majority of the gross revenue off the top through opaque consulting and promotional fees, leaving the fighter with the physical damage and a heavily taxed net payout. To maintain the grueling championship schedule demanded by his handlers, Randall's body required an unsustainable level of output. By late 1994, the biological reality of aging in a combat sport began to manifest. At 33, fast-twitch muscle fibers degrade. The cardiovascular engine loses its maximum output capacity. The recovery window between training sessions doubles. The cartilage in the shoulders and hands begins to disintegrate. For a protected fighter, this decline is managed through carefully selected opponents and long rest periods. For an exploited asset like Randall, rest was not permitted. He was forced to fight 4 times in 1995 just to keep the revenue flowing to the top of the pyramid. To survive the physical deterioration and the crushing psychological weight of his trapped existence, Randall turned to a chemical crutch. He did not use narcotics for recreation. He used them for functional survival. His dependency on cocaine escalated rapidly. In the context of a decaying professional fighter, cocaine serves a specific destructive utility. It provides a synthetic dopamine surge that temporarily overrides the extreme physical pain of training camps. It masks the psychological depression of systemic exploitation. It acts as a powerful appetite suppressant, allowing an aging fighter to artificially strip water and muscle mass to make the strict 140-pound weight limit without relying on the grueling cardiovascular work his body could no longer handle. But cocaine was not the only substance. Randall began utilizing theophylline. Theophylline is a potent bronchodilator, traditionally prescribed in clinical settings to treat severe asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In the unregulated underground of 1990s boxing, it was heavily abused as a performance-enhancing drug. It artificially relaxes the smooth muscles in the airways, forcing the lungs to process higher volumes of oxygen. For an aging fighter struggling with stamina, theophylline acts as a synthetic third lung. It allows a degraded cardiovascular system to operate in the deep waters of a 12-round championship fight. The pharmacological combination of cocaine and theophylline is a lethal cocktail. Both act as severe central nervous system stimulants. They accelerate the heart rate, spike blood pressure, and place massive, unnatural stress on the cardiovascular system. When combined with the extreme physical exertion of a professional boxing match and the blunt force trauma of repeated head strikes, the risk of catastrophic cardiac arrest or a cerebral hemorrhage multiplies exponentially. The boxing industry gatekeepers were not blind to this. The trainers holding the mitts, the promoters booking the flights, and the commissioned doctors conducting the pre-fight physicals are professionals trained to spot physical anomalies. The signs of severe stimulant abuse in a fighter are glaringly obvious. Drastic, rapid weight fluctuations, excessive sweating during basic movements, erratic resting heart rates, dilated pupils during locker room examinations, and severe mood swings. The syndicate saw every red flag. They simply ignored them. The entire apparatus adopted a policy of deliberate, profitable negligence. As long as Randall could physically walk up the steel steps and hear the opening bell, They were willing to risk his sudden death on national television. They did not offer him rehabilitation. They offered him more fights. The physical decay became undeniable. On January 13, 1996, Randall was ordered into a rematch with Juan Martin Kogi. The fight was a sloppy, grueling affair. Randall's reflexes were noticeably slower. His punches lacked the clinical snap of his earlier years. In the fourth round, an accidental clash of heads left Kogi injured. The fight went to the scorecards early, and Kogi was awarded a technical decision. Randall lost the WBA title. The promotional machine immediately enforced another rematch clause. They shipped Randall to Buenos Aires, Argentina, for the rubber match on August 16, 1996. Fighting Kogi in his home country was designed to be a cash-out fight. Randall was supposed to lose, allowing the promoters to extract one final international payday from his name. Instead, operating purely on muscle memory and chemical stimulation, Randall fought a brutal 12 rounds and won a unanimous decision, capturing the WBA title for the third time. He had survived the ring, but he could not survive the regulatory trap. Following the bout, the Argentine Boxing Federation mandated a standard post-fight urinalysis. For years, Randall had managed to navigate the notoriously lax drug testing protocols of American athletic commissions, which frequently lost samples or accepted bribes to alter results. The Argentine Commission, however, had no financial incentive to protect an American fighter. The toxicology report was devastating and definitive. The laboratory results confirmed the presence of high levels of cocaine metabolites and theophylline in Randall's system. The clinical proof of his addiction and the links to which he was going to artificially sustain his career were now public record. The reaction from the boxing establishment was immediate, hypocritical, and entirely predictable. The WBA did not launch an investigation into Don King Productions. They did not question the managers who facilitated the fights. They did not sanction the cornermen who supplied the theophylline. They instantly scapegoated the fighter. The WBA suspended Randall and stripped him of his super lightweight championship. The title was subsequently handed to Khalid Rahilu in early 1997. The media, which had spent years profiting off his blood, immediately branded him a junkie. They framed his downfall as a personal moral failure, completely ignoring the structural environment that drove him to self-destruction. The promoters, who had knowingly pumped a drug-addicted aging fighter into 12-round wars, washed their hands of the situation. The positive drug test in Argentina was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable conclusion of a predatory business model. The system had successfully extracted 3 world championships out of Frankie Randall, using his body to break Julio César Chávez and forcing him to rely on dangerous stimulants just to survive the grueling workload. When the Foreign Commission exposed the medical evidence of this abuse, the syndicate faced zero legal repercussions. Instead, they weaponized that very toxicology report as a legal mechanism to excommunicate him. They discarded their WBA champion without a severance package, leaving a neurologically damaged 36-year-old man completely isolated, setting the stage for the most gruesome chapter of his life. The human skull is a highly engineered biological vault, but it was not designed to withstand a 2-decade career of blunt force trauma. By the time Frankie Randall approached his 40th birthday, his brain was undergoing a catastrophic, irreversible structural collapse. He was no longer simply an aging athlete suffering from diminishing reflexes. He was a patient actively succumbing to 2 distinct, devastating neurological diseases: Parkinson's disease and dementia pugilistica, commonly known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Every time Randall absorbed a heavy blow, his brain violently decelerated against the jagged interior walls of his skull. This repetitive shearing force tore the microscopic axons that transmit signals across the brain. Over thousands of sparring rounds and 70 professional fights, this trauma triggered the rapid accumulation of tau proteins. These rogue proteins spread like a neurological virus, strangling healthy brain tissue and destroying the frontal lobe, the center for memory, impulse control, and executive function. Simultaneously, the repeated impacts were destroying his substantia nigra, the critical region of the brain responsible for producing dopamine. Without dopamine, the central nervous system loses its ability to coordinate smooth muscle movements. This is the mechanism of Parkinson's disease. The symptoms were not invisible. They do not hide on an MRI machine. They manifest in broad daylight. By the late 1990s, Randall was displaying glaring, undeniable clinical markers of severe neurological decay. His speech, once sharp and direct, degraded into a slow, labored slur. His resting posture was characterized by the distinct rhythmic tremors associated with dopamine depletion. His gait became stiff, his balance compromised. He was suffering from chronic memory lapses and severe cognitive fog. In any legitimate, regulated industry, a medical professional observing these symptoms would immediately revoke the individual's occupational license and mandate intensive neurological care. In the American boxing industry, these symptoms were viewed as a minor administrative hurdle. The managers, promoters, and matchmakers who controlled Randall's schedule were fully aware of his condition. They sat across from him in locker rooms and watched his hands shake. They listened to his slurred speech during contract negotiations. They knew he was physically deteriorating, but they also knew his name still held residual equity. He was still the surgeon. He was still the man who beat Chavez. In the ruthless economy of professional boxing, an aging former champion with a recognizable name is a highly valuable commodity. Up-and-coming prospects need recognizable names on their resumes to secure television contracts. Promoters of these young prospects are willing to pay a premium to import an aging legend, provided the legend is guaranteed to lose. Randall was no longer being booked to win. He was being booked as a human crash test dummy, paid to absorb damage and artificially inflate the market value of the next generation. But to execute this transaction, the promoters had to circumvent medical regulations. A fighter exhibiting Parkinsonian tremors cannot legally pass a standard pre-fight neurological exam. This is where the exploitation escalated into outright medical fraud and coordinated criminal negligence. The United States boxing landscape is not governed by a centralized federal authority like the NFL or the NBA. It is a fractured, chaotic network of 50 independent state athletic commissions operating under the loosely affiliated Association of Boxing Commissions. The regulations vary wildly from border to border. Elite regulatory bodies like the Nevada State Athletic Commission or the New York State Athletic Commission enforce stringent medical protocols for older fighters. They mandate comprehensive MRIs, electroencephalograms, and dilated ophthalmological exams to detect retinal tearing. If an MRI detects a subdural hematoma or severe cerebral atrophy, the fighter is permanently banned. The handlers controlling Frankie Randall simply bypassed the legitimate commissions. They engaged in a predatory practice known as jurisdiction shopping. When Randall's brain damage became too obvious to hide from competent doctors, His team stopped booking fights in heavily regulated states. They exported him to the regulatory backwaters of the sport. States and foreign municipalities, where athletic commissions were chronically underfunded, incompetent, or inherently corrupt. To bypass the few medical hurdles that did exist in these lower-tier jurisdictions, a sophisticated network of medical bribery and document falsification was utilized. The conflict of interest built into the sport's infrastructure makes this entirely feasible. In many jurisdictions, the ringside physician and the doctor conducting the pre-fight physical are not independent state employees. They are independent contractors hired and paid directly by the event's promoter. If the hired doctor examines the main event fighter, correctly diagnoses neurological decay, and cancels the bout, the promoter loses hundreds of thousands of dollars in venue deposits, ticket refunds, and broadcast rights. A doctor who ruins a promoter's investment is a doctor who is never hired to work a boxing event again. It is a silent, mutually understood extortion racket. The men orchestrating Randall's twilight career exploited this racket flawlessly. They located compliant, morally bankrupt medical professionals willing to look the other way. For a few $100s, these doctors would conduct flashlight physicals, a cursory glance at the fighter's pupils, a quick check of the blood pressure, and a signature on a state commission form declaring a clinically brain-damaged man entirely fit for professional combat. When commissions demanded MRIs, outdated pre-existing scans from years prior were often submitted, or the paperwork was simply forged. This was not a failure of the system. The system operated exactly as it was designed. The legal loopholes, the fragmented state commissions, and the financial leverage over ringside physicians were established to ensure that the flow of capital was never interrupted by something as trivial as an athlete's physical health. Frankie Randall was stripped of his agency. His frontal lobe decay severely compromised his ability to make rational decisions regarding his own safety. He could not assess risk. He could not comprehend the long-term consequences of stepping back into the ring. He was a cognitively disabled man functioning on pure muscle memory and the manipulative commands of the men who controlled his finances. They isolated him, kept him broke, and presented getting punched in the head as his only viable method of survival. They effectively converted a 3-time world champion into a victim of regulated human trafficking. They forged the necessary medical clearances, bypassed the legal safeguards, and propped up a man suffering from Parkinson's disease and CTE under the arena lights. The boxing industry had weaponized medical science against him, utilizing corrupt doctors not to heal him, but to legally sign his death warrant 1 round at a time. The infrastructure was locked in place, preparing to extract the absolute final drops of his blood in the most brutal, humiliating stretch of his life. The period between 1998 and 2005 in Frankie Randall's life was no longer a professional athletic career. He had been officially absorbed into the darkest, most unregulated tier of the boxing economy, the stepping stone circuit. Following the exposure of his chemical dependencies and the rapid acceleration of his neurological decay, the elite promoters who had once used him to headline pay-per-views discarded him. But Randall was not permitted to walk away. He was absorbed into a much darker, strictly unregulated tier of the boxing economy, the stepping stone circuit. In the architecture of professional boxing, a highly touted prospect cannot simply be placed into a world title fight. They must be built. Their records must be artificially inflated, and their public profiles must be validated by defeating recognizable names. The industry relies on a specific class of veteran fighters to serve as human sacrifices for this process. They are called opponents, gatekeepers, or stepping stones. A stepping stone must possess two distinct characteristics: a name that the betting public recognizes, and a body that is completely incapable of winning. Frankie Randall, the former three-time world champion and the man who broke Julio César Chávez, possessed the most valuable name on the discard pile. Between 1998 and his final bout in 2005, Randall fought 16 times. He lost 13 of those contests. This was not a slump. This was the precise execution of a business plan. The men acting as his managers brokered his name to the promoters of aggressive young prospects. The contracts were signed with a mutual, unspoken understanding. Randall was being paid to absorb a beating and lose. The infrastructure transformed a clinically disabled man into a bloody launch pad for the next generation of boxing stars. The physical reality of these fights was grotesque. Randall was stepping into the ring with men 15 to 20 years his junior. These were not aging veterans. They were prime, explosive athletes. Randall, suffering from the advanced stages of Parkinson's disease and severe frontal lobe decay, had lost the fundamental physical tools required for self-defense. His legs, once capable of creating sharp angles, were stiff and unyielding. His fast twitch reflexes had entirely evaporated. He could see the punches coming, but the damaged neural pathways in his brain could no longer transmit the signal to his hands in time to block them. He was trapped inside a failing biological shell, forced to stand flat-footed and absorb the blunt force trauma. The matchmakers fed him to Antonio Margarito. Margarito was a notoriously ruthless, high-volume Mexican brawler known as the Tijuana Tornado. Margarito did not possess finesse. He relied on relentless, forward-marching violence. Putting a neurologically shattered Randall into a confined space with a prime Margarito was an act of extreme negligence. It was a sanctioned assault. Margarito battered the aging veteran, using Randall's legendary name to legitimize his own ascent up the welterweight rankings. Randall offered no meaningful resistance. He simply absorbed the punishment until the referee intervened or his body collapsed. The promoters collected their percentage, the young prospect secured a marquee victory, and Randall was left to deal with the compounding cerebral hemorrhaging. The cycle repeated with chilling efficiency. He was shipped off to face Peter Manfredo Jr., a rising American prospect building a television-friendly resume. The result was identical. The crowds cheered the young knockout artists, entirely ignorant or willfully blind to the fact that they were watching the systematic abuse of a patient suffering from neurodegenerative disease. State athletic commissions sanctioned these bouts. Referees oversaw the violence. Ringside physicians collected their checks. The entire apparatus of the sport was completely complicit in the slow-motion execution of Frankie Randall. The ultimate, most cynical exploitation occurred on May 22, 2004. Julio César Chávez, the man whose undefeated aura Randall had shattered 10 years prior, was conducting a massive farewell tour. Chávez wanted to retire with a series of spectacular televised victories. He needed an opponent who would generate massive public interest, but posed absolutely zero physical threat to his aging body. The promoters immediately targeted Randall. They billed it as El Adios. They marketed it as the epic final chapter of a historic rivalry. It was a complete fraud. The event took place at the Plaza de Toros in Mexico City, safely outside the jurisdiction of stringent American medical regulations. The fight was a 10-round public humiliation. Chávez, still retaining some of his legendary power, systematically dismantled a man who could barely maintain his balance. Randall had nothing left. His punches were slow, looping, and entirely ineffective. For 30 minutes, Chávez used Randall as a heavy bag in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. It was a vanity project built entirely on the physical suffering of a disabled man. When the final bell rang, Chávez secured his revenge. The promoters secured a massive box office gate, and Randall was quietly escorted back to the locker room to assess the fresh damage to his brain tissue. By late 2004, Randall's condition had deteriorated to a point where even the most corrupt commissions struggled to justify licensing him. He had lost his last 5 consecutive fights by brutal stoppage or lopsided decision. Following a devastating loss to Marco Antonio Rubio, another heavy-handed Mexican prospect, who used Randall's name as a resume builder, Randall officially announced his retirement on January 1, 2005. But the cartel was not finished. A retirement announcement holds no legal weight against the financial demands of predatory managers. Randall was completely broke. Millions of dollars in career purses had been siphoned off by promoters, managers, lawyers, and the IRS. He had no pension, no medical insurance, and no savings. His handlers leveraged this absolute destitution. They refused to let him stop. They forced the 43-year-old disabled man to sign contracts for 2 more professional fights in 2005. They dragged him back into the ring to extract the final pennies of his market value. He lost both fights. When the promoters finally determined that there was no remaining financial value to extract, they cut the cord. There was no farewell press conference. There was no severance check. They simply stopped returning his phone calls. The final ledger of Frankie Randall's professional existence reads as follows: 77 professional bouts, 58 victories, 42 knockouts, 18 losses, 1 draw. The boxing industry presents these numbers as a testament to a long, hard-fought athletic career. That is a deliberate mischaracterization. Those statistics are an autopsy report. They represent 24 years of systemic exploitation. They represent the exact number of times a corrupt infrastructure willingly placed a compromised human being into a zone of extreme physical danger for corporate profit. The 77 bouts represent the total liquidation of his cognitive function. Frankie Randall did not retire from boxing. He was discarded because the machine had successfully consumed every single usable cell in his body. The silence that follows a discarded fighter is absolute. When Frankie Randall was officially cut loose by the boxing syndicate in late 2005, the phone stopped ringing. The managers, cornermen, and promoters who had engineered his schedule for 2 decades evaporated overnight. He was 44 years old. Biologically, his body was decades older. The industry had successfully extracted 3 world championships, 77 professional fights, and millions of dollars in gross revenue from his labor. Once his neurological decay advanced to a stage where he could no longer stand upright to absorb punishment, his market value hit 0. The machine turned him off. The financial reality of his retirement requires a forensic audit. Despite headlining pay-per-view events and generating massive gate revenues at the MGM Grand, Randall was left utterly bankrupt. A fighter's gross purse in the 1990s was heavily taxed by the infrastructure. The promoter took the top percentage. The manager took a legally mandated 33%. Sanctioning bodies extracted fees for the belts. State athletic commissions took a cut for the licenses. The IRS demanded the rest. What little net capital Randall managed to secure was rapidly consumed by predatory advance loans from promoters and the basic costs of training camps. By 2006, the money was gone. Unlike professional baseball or football, boxing has no central players' union. There is no collective bargaining agreement. There is no pension. There is no post-career medical insurance. The Las Vegas casino infrastructure privatized the millions generated by his violence and entirely socialized the medical consequences. By 2010, the dual pathologies of Parkinson's disease and dementia pugilistica had fully taken over his central nervous system. The progression of chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a brutal, methodical eradication of the brain's physical structure. The tau proteins accumulating in his cortex systematically severed the neural pathways responsible for basic human function. His motor skills failed. The Parkinsonian tremors made basic tasks such as feeding himself impossible. He lost the ability to walk unassisted. The cognitive destruction was clinical and total. The disease consumed his frontal lobe. He suffered from severe paranoia and crippling dementia. He became trapped in a fragmented reality. His family was financially unequipped to manage the 24-hour specialized medical care required for a rapidly decaying neurological patient. They had no financial backing from the sport that destroyed him. They relied on state assistance. Randall was placed into an assisted living facility in Tennessee. The former three-time world champion became a ward of the state. American taxpayers were left footing the medical bill for a catastrophe engineered by boxing promoters. He spent nearly a decade in that facility. He was heavily medicated to manage extreme physical discomfort and severe behavioral outbursts. His son, DeMarcus Randall, provided an unflinching assessment of his father's condition. DeMarcus described his father as a shell, a man stuck in time. Frankie Randall did not know he was a world champion. He did not remember the Julio César Chávez fight. Toward the end, he could not recognize his own reflection in the mirror, let alone the faces of his children. The system did not just break his body, it systematically erased his identity. The contrast is stark. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, which allowed his title to be stripped, continued to sanction megafights. Julio César Chávez retired to the life of a wealthy national hero. The promoters who brokered his bloody stepping stone fights faced zero criminal charges for elder abuse. The entire apparatus operated with total legal and financial immunity. Frankie Randall's biological engine finally failed on December 23, 2020. He was 59 years old. The official cause of death was complications from dementia pugilistica and Parkinson's disease. The capitalist machinery of American boxing created a god for one night in 1994, drained his blood for the next 11 years, and left the empty shell in a Tennessee nursing home to die. The case is closed, the profits are secured, and the system moves on to the next body.